While the end of World War I caused an unprecedented wave of economic euphoria in the United States, in other places of the world this situation was quite different. Africa remained subjugated by European nations. In the rest of America, ruled an exclusive and exploitative agrarian elite. Europe struggled to rebuild their countries. At the same time, Russia, which would become part of the Soviet Union from 1922, represented a strong state and a future of equality and social justice. Although they had antagonistic characteristics from an ideological point of view, the authoritarian movements that emerged in Europe and the Soviet government centered on the figure of Josef Stalin from 1924 onwards converged towards totalitarianism. No previous regime resembled this new form of control of power. One of the hallmarks of totalitarianism is the concentration of power in the hands of a small group of people who organize themselves in a single party. This party also relies on a popular base, but only its leaders have decision-making powers, and they are the ones who occupy the middle and high positions in public administration. Thus, through police repression, they exert power over individuals. In this, freedom is suppressed and there is a regime based on terror and obedience. Another striking feature of the totalitarian state is the use of ideological propaganda, which exalts the regime, the government, and the leader, personified in the head of the state, the highest leader of the government, portrayed with almost superhuman qualities. The control characteristics of the totalitarian state, therefore, are limited to terror, propaganda, and the suppression of individuals and collective rights, which are also imposed on private life of citizens. Making extensive use of censorship and violence, mainly against minorities such as gypsies, immigrants, etc., the totalitarian regimes established themselves in several European countries after the First World War. Next, we'll see three different forms of totalitarianism in Europe: Italian Fascism, German Nazism, and Soviet Stalinism. Late allies of the victorious nations of World War I, the Italians did not obtain important territorial compensations after the end of the conflict, such as the annexation of one of the former German colonies in Africa or from the nearest regions in the Balkans. So it wasn't worth it to have entered the war, taking into account the serious economic crisis, inflation, famine, and unemployment resulting from the conflict. This situation favored several social movements and workers in revolt against the government. In 1919, a former combatant, Benito Mussolini, founded the Fascism Combattimento, an extreme nationalist group. They defended the establishment of a strong and authoritarian government capable of containing the left groups and to put an end to strikes and operational demonstrations. With around 320,000 supporters at the beginning of the 1920s, the Fascism Combattimento counted on black shirts, armed militias dressed in black shirts, who acted cruelly against opponents. They murdered left-wing militants, dissolved workers' demonstrations, and intimidated democratically oriented politicians, all under the complacency of the government of King Victor Emmanuel III. In 1921, the Fascism Combattimento unified under the authority of Mussolini and they constituted the National Fascist Party. Its support base was formed above all by unemployed people, ex-combatants, members of the middle class, industrialists, and owners fearful that Italy would become the scene of a communist revolution. In the 1921 parliamentary elections, 35 fascist deputies were elected, among them Mussolini. In 1922, in a show of strength, around 30,000 black shirts under Mussolini's leadership, invaded the Italian capital, occupying public buildings and railway stations. The episode became known as March on Rome. 2 days later, fascism would come to power. King Victor Emmanuel III invited Mussolini to take over as prime minister. Gradually, Mussolini expanded his powers and established himself as a dictator. The National Fascist Party became the only party. All others were extinct. The government also began to censor the media and suppress the right to strike. All organizations that did not have fascist leanings became illegal. In the early 1930s, the Duce, as Mussolini was known, already centralized all power. In order to indoctrinate children and young people into the fascist ideology, teachers at schools and universities had the obligation to extol the achievements of the regime and aspects of the Duce's life. Organizations were also created to promote parties, competitions, camps, outdoor activities, so that they would transmit the fascist ideology to the young. Mussolini also used the mass media, newspaper, radio programs, and documentaries to publicize the achievements of his government and spread a cult to his figure. Two other aspects of fascist politics contributed to its consolidation among the Italian people. The first was the massive intervention of the state in the economy, especially after the New York Stock Exchange crash in 1929. To preserve itself from the crisis, the fascist state launched a broad program of construction of public works, roads, bridges, etc., and encouraged weapons production. These measures brought down unemployment levels. The second aspect of this policy was the institution in 1927 of the Carta del Lavoro, labor charter, in which concessions to workers were mixed with measures of police control. The charter established, for example, insurance against accidents at work and guaranteed an 8-hour workday, but it prohibited strikes and extinguished unions. In 1935, Mussolini ordered the invasion of Ethiopia, which was one of the two African countries not yet dominated by Europeans. The following year, he intervened in the Spanish Civil War, sending troops in support of the forces of Spanish General Francisco Franco. Fascist principles were not, however, restricted to Italy. With the consolidation of Mussolini's government, there were also dictatorships of the extreme right also in other European countries, such as Portugal, Hungary, and Poland. This was the context of the rise of Nazism in 1933 in Germany. At the end of World War I, Germany entered a socio-economic and political crisis of major proportions. Armed rebellions by socialist groups trying to seize power, the economy devastated by the fines imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, and one of the biggest inflations of all time. In addition, there was a sense of humiliation and dishonor arising from the harsh terms of the Treaty of Peace. Under these conditions, in 1919, the National Socialist German Workers was formed, which in German would give rise to the expression Nazi, led by Austrian Adolf Hitler. With an ultra-nationalist orientation, the Nazi Party proposed the establishment of a government capable of unifying the Germans and regaining national greatness. German Nazis were known as SA, acronym in German for assault troops. In addition to violently repressing communists and socialists, the SA guaranteed the safety of Nazi allies. In November 1923, Hitler, supported by the party, tried to carry out a coup d'etat, failed, and was arrested. In jail, he wrote the book Mein Kampf, in which he systematized the Nazi ideology. In the book, he defended the supposed purity and superiority of Aryan people over other ethnic groups. The book also claims the right from the Germans to a living space, that is, a territory in Europe that would bring together the Germanic people in one empire. Hitler did not initially gain significant support. However, in the 1930s, the New York Stock Exchange crashed and the Great Depression ruined the middle class and millions of German workers were unemployed. In this way, the crisis caused widespread disbelief in liberal principles. With his exaltation of the Aryan race, Hitler seemed to be the predestined leader, able to rescue the national honor and to place Germany again between the great powers. The Nazi Party began to grow. Thus, between 1930 and 1932, the number of Nazi deputies in parliament increased from 170 to 230. The following year, the president of Germany, Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, invited Hitler to fill the post of Chancellor. With the appointment of Hitler, the Nazis came to power in Germany, initiating what they considered the Third German Reich. After the death of Marshal Hindenburg in August 1934, Hitler unified the offices of Chancellor and President, thus adopting the title of Führer. Upon assuming power, Hitler annulled the 1919 Democratic Constitution, instituted censorship, suspended civil rights and guarantees, and instituted the anti-Semitism as official state policy. Members of the Gestapo, German secret police, and the SS, elite Nazi troops, began to pursue, arrest, and torture priests, gypsies, LGBT+, Jewish people, union leaders, communists, and opponents in general. For example, people with disabilities were forcibly admitted and had to go through sterilization surgeries. In addition to terror and repression, the Nazi ideological propaganda was also present on film, documentaries, radio shows, and posters. Hitler's rallies, which drew thousands of people, were painstakingly prepared to demonstrate the greatness of the Führer and the German people. Indoctrination also involved children in the classroom. From an early age, they learned to be proud of belonging to the Aryan race, in addition to venerate and render obedience to the Führer. The regime's popularity grew even more with the economic recovery of the country. Due to state intervention, public works were carried out, the armaments industry was boosted, and economic planning renovated. With the expansion of credit, fiscal policies, and specific policies investment, in addition to the population's access to durable consumer goods, taxes on many products have been reduced to encourage the industry. Investing in public works, such as road construction and building maintenance, in turn generated a large number of jobs. Large international and national capitalists also helped financially the Nazi government. With economic growth and the support of the population, Hitler began to violate the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles signed at the end of the First World War. He remilitarized Germany and implemented an expansionist territorial policy. He thus paved the way for World War II. In December 1925, just over a year after Lenin's death, Josef Stalin officially assumed command of the Soviet Union. The new leader increasingly centralized power, abolished the democratic resources of the Soviets, suppressed individual rights, arrested and murdered opponents, and created a one-party totalitarian state, the Communist Party of Soviet Union. To modernize the country and make it grow economically, Stalin put in practice from 1928 the 5-year plans, which consisted of development programs based on nationalized economic planning. The government invested in the machinery and equipment industry at the expense of the consumer goods industry. Steel mills, chemical and oil industries, tractor and agricultural equipment factories were built. In the countryside, a forced collectivization policy was applied, with the nationalization of rural properties transformed into huge collective farms and large cooperatives. The government also promoted an educational reform that practically ended illiteracy in the country. The transport and housing became accessible to the population. However, individual and collective rights were practically extinct and strikes were prohibited. The secret police pursued opponents of the regime and even former allies. Between 1936 and 1938, more than 5 million Soviets were arrested. Many ended up executed. Peasants who reacted to the government were also arrested and murdered. About 11 million of these people were eventually deported. Many were sent to the gulags, forced labor camps created throughout the country to shelter opponents of the regime. Stalin was worshipped through military parades and in huge portraits. With it, the dream of an egalitarian and democratic society of the first socialists turned into the nightmare of an iron police state controlled by Communist Party leadership.